One of the things used to help children learn is a drawing book filled with only the faintest outline of a picture, like you see up here. There are dots along this outline with numbers next to them. The child learns about counting by drawing from one dot to the next according to the pattern that's established there, beginning with the number 1. When completed, the child has a picture to color if he has connected the dots properly. Part of our growth in the Lord requires that we learn how to connect the dots in our learning process. We learn about stories in the Bible from Sunday school. Most of us learned about David and Goliath, Noah's Ark, Moses, the Ten Commandments, and so on. Learned about Adam and Eve. Learned about David's wars. Kids love stories. And if these stories are presented correctly, they will develop a fascination with the stories. They like to retell those stories. As we get older, though, those stories should take on deeper meaning as we learn what they are meant to teach us. The stories are there for a reason. Paul lets us know that is how we are to understand many of the Old Testament stories. He says these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Now in this section, Paul was rehearsing the wilderness wanderings of the Israelites after they left Egypt. The point he's making is that there are lessons we should learn from these historical events as they're recorded in the Bible. We should be able to connect the dots of their experience to see the big picture of God's dealing with us. However, we should not only learn from the events themselves, but we should also learn from the characters that we read about in these stories. We know of David's adultery, but God used him. We know of Moses committing murder, but God used him. We know of King Saul, the first king of the Jews, and how God rejected him. On and on the list could go if we were to focus on character studies. Now today's gospel presents us with an interesting character named Philip. We should consider Philip. Philip is not often used as much of an example, but I think there are some things we can learn from this person. The name Philip occurs 32 times in the New Testament and refers to 4 different individuals. 2 of those individuals are part of the government structure, and the other 2 are followers of Jesus. One of those followers is part of the first group of deacons ever established for the church, and the other is an apostle whom Jesus called to follow him. In John chapter 1 and verse 43, we read, the next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, follow me. Now, we're not told anything about Philip, what he was doing or who he was. We only know that he was from the town of Bethsaida, the same as Andrew and Peter. However, the words, follow me, from the lips of the master must have had enough power in them to change the course of Philip's life. Because the record shows that he did indeed follow the Lord. The next thing we find Philip doing is sharing his experience. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Philip was convinced he had found what his other friends were looking for. He did like we do with a good movie or a new restaurant. Oh man, you got to go and taste that food. It's out of sight. But when someone responds with some sort of doubt, we just say, man, you got to go try it for yourself. That's what happened with Philip's encounter with Nathanael. Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Nathanael wasn't so sure anything good could come from that little town of Nazareth. Philip didn't argue with him or try to persuade him. Didn't use examples or anything else. He simply said, "Come and see." Now we see that same statement a little earlier in this same gospel account. When John the Baptist was baptizing there in the river, and he saw Jesus walking and said, "Behold the Lamb of God," two of John's disciples took off running to follow Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 9th hour. Now, each of these situations reveals something we should take to heart when people ask us something. People today want to be told the answer. They want to be told what to believe. Jesus could have answered the way any of us would do and given his address. "I live at 2699 East Taliban Road." That's not what he did. He said, "Check it out for yourself." He didn't say, "Come by tomorrow when I've had a chance to clean and straighten up." He said, "Come and see." He said, "Check me out. See how I live." Philip did not try to persuade Nathanael. He didn't allow Nate's doubt to cause any concern. He left the ball in the doubter's court and told him to see for himself. Why? Because when you give people an answer, they don't own it. When you give people an answer, they can still readily pick it apart and continue to doubt, to be filled with the next question. Parents have a hard time learning that with their children. Why? 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 And every time you answer the question, the next question is why? If we could learn to say, "Well, what do you think?" It would teach them to start thinking and looking for the answer themselves. And we'll see this again with Jesus and Philip, only this time, Philip is the one being taught something. In John chapter 6 and verse 5, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get even a little. Jesus put what we call a leading question to Philip. He caused Philip to stay in his natural mind with his natural thinking by asking, "Where could we buy bread?" What would have been Philip's response if Jesus had asked, "Philip, what should we do?" Do you see how more open that is? The first question limits. The second question is wide open. Now, this was early in the life of the disciples, and that would have been too much for this young man to handle. There had been too much pressure. Jesus knew what he was going to do, even though he gave Philip a little test. And that word translated test here is used to prove something of value. If you know what a touchstone is, it's a stone designed a certain way. You can touch a piece of gold to it and know whether it is true gold or not. It's a touchstone. That's the kind of test. Now, for sure, Jesus knew Philip's response would remain in the natural. That's how he asked the question. The test was for Philip to learn to lift his eyes above the temporal. Now, this is where Jesus fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5,000 people got full, so full that there was 12 baskets of crumbs left over. Have you ever thought about what the disciples were thinking while they were passing out this food. They started with 5 loaves of bread, probably small, sandwich size, and just 2 fish. And they're out there passing out the food. If someone asked them where they get their food, their only response at that time was probably along the lines, I don't know, man. Just take it, eat, and leave me alone. Those 12 boys had to be more astonished than the rest of the crowd who didn't actually see what was happening. People at the back of the crowd didn't know what he had started with. The disciples knew. Now, the next time we see Philip, some Gentiles came, they were called Greeks, and told Philip that they wanted to see Jesus. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Now, Philip wasn't too sure about this. They're Gentiles. We're Jews. So he didn't invite them to come and see. Instead, he went and told Andrew, and apparently Andrew wasn't too sure either. So together they went and told Jesus that outsiders wanted to see him. Now, this was towards the end of Jesus' ministry, so they should have been able to figure out that it would have been okay. Jesus had shown them through his actions that he had come for everyone, Jews and Gentiles alike. He had healed the Syrophoenician woman. He had been mingled with the Gentiles and those outside the Jewish tradition. But that lesson had not yet penetrated the disciples. I'm kind of slow that way myself. It takes time for something to dawn on me, even though I've seen many examples. Gracie often says that I am just too dense to connect the dots. I'm just not able to connect the dots. Philip had not yet been able to connect the dots about whom Jesus had come for. However, there was still one more major dot to connect it all together that Philip was about to confront. Jesus is telling the disciples about his soon demise and that he was going to be with the Father. Philip, not yet able to draw it all together, said, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Sounds like a good, noble statement. Philip, still with his natural mind, could see Jesus standing in front of him, talking about the Father, who apparently was somewhere else. Jesus answers by giving Philip more than he bargained for. Jesus said to him, Have I been with you so long, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, Show us the Father? Philip, you've been with me 3 years now. It's time you started to put things together. It's time you started connecting the dots with what you've seen and heard. The works that I have done, I did because I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And if you have a hard time believing that, you should at least believe because of the works that I've done. Connect the dots, Philip. Step out of your natural mind and recognize the reality of what you have been involved in. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. There's nothing else for me to show you. Philip's world was being shaken by this revelation. Everything he had ever known was challenged with this one statement from his rabbi, If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. The God Philip thought he knew was angry and vengeful, but Jesus wasn't like that. In Luke chapter 9, we read a story where Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem and going through a town, and it says they in that town did not receive him because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? But he turned and rebuked them and said, "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." That's a different God than Philip believed. The God that Philip understood wanted to destroy all his enemies, but Jesus said, "I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you." Contrary to what Philip had known. The God whom Philip served had a long list of things that he had to do in order to be in God's favor, but Jesus had only two. Jesus answered, "The most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Imagine Philip's consternation. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And what I've seen about Jesus does not connect with the God that I've been brought up to believe in. Philip is now stuck with trying to reconcile what he had just heard with what he has believed all his life. The two things obviously contradict each other. Which is right? Which is true? Philip is not much different from most of us in a similar situation, I think. New truth can often bring confusion. Too often, though, people take the confusion as a sign that the new thing is wrong, when in actuality, it may just be the door to wisdom. Even though I was no longer a practicing Catholic, when I heard that there was only one mediator between God and man, I reacted negatively. I opposed that thought. I knew what I had been taught, and that wasn't it. I had Mary, I had the angels, I had saints, I had the priests, I had nuns, I had all kinds of people standing between me and God. And this Baptist fellow tells me there's only one mediator between me and God. Didn't compute. Thankfully, though, the Lord was already teaching me how to consider things rather than just toss them out at first blush. I began to connect the dots of what I was experiencing with what I was hearing. I was unable to connect the dots of what I had been taught with what I was now learning. What I was learning had much more appeal than what I thought I knew before. We know that Philip was able to eventually come to grips with what Jesus had told him. So the question before us today, from Philip's experience, the question is, what do you do with something that upsets your apple cart? What do you do with that which challenges what you've always believed? I suggest take some time to try to connect the dots to see if there's a picture hidden in those dots. The same way that a child discovers a picture hidden in all the dots that they connect. Can we connect the dots of our learning and our experience and make it all fit together? The problem that I've had in my own life for so long is that I had this section of dots and this section of dots and this section of dots, and they didn't connect. But now the Lord is expanding all of those and bringing it together where there's one unified whole. That makes a lot more sense than to believe, like Philip did, there's this God of anger, and then there's this God of mercy. There aren't two. How do we meld them together? Take time to consider when God shows you something that challenges what you've always believed. Amen.